The avoidant walks into therapy, reads the books, listens to the podcasts, follows the attachment-focused accounts. They learn the language of their patterns. They can articulate their triggers. They understand intellectually why they push people away, where their fear of intimacy originated, how their childhood shaped their adult relationships. They talk about their avoidant attachment style with a clinical detachment that makes them sound self-aware and evolved. They've done the work, or so they believe. They've healed, they tell themselves. But something strange happens after this supposed healing. They don't become more capable of intimacy. They become more defended. They don't develop greater capacity for vulnerability. They develop more sophisticated ways to justify their emotional unavailability. They don't transform into secure attachment. They transform into avoidance with a vocabulary that makes their dysfunction sound like enlightened boundaries. They become worse, not better. And the tragedy is that neither they nor the people they date realize what's happened until significant damage has been done. The problem begins with what the avoidant mistakes for healing. They approach their attachment wounds the same way they approach everything else. Intellectually, from a safe distance, with minimal actual emotional engagement. They learn about attachment theory as if they're studying a subject in school rather than examining their own lived experience. They can explain dismissive avoidant patterns with impressive accuracy while remaining completely disconnected from the feelings beneath those patterns. They've acquired knowledge without transformation, information without integration, awareness without change. And this pseudo-healing is more dangerous than their original unconscious avoidance because now they have sophisticated language to weaponize against anyone who asks them for genuine intimacy. What makes this particularly insidious is that the avoidant genuinely believes they've healed. They've spent time in therapy. They've done the reading. They can identify their patterns when they're happening. They think this awareness equals progress, but awareness without behavioral change is just narration. It's watching yourself repeat the same patterns while commenting on what you're doing, but not actually doing anything different. The avoidant who can say, I'm deactivating right now because intimacy triggers my fear while still deactivating, hasn't actually made progress. They've just become a more articulate version of their defended self. And that articulation gives them permission to continue their patterns while feeling evolved about it. The weaponization of therapy language. The healed avoidant has acquired a dangerous new tool. Therapeutic language they can use to make their emotional unavailability sound like healthy self-care. They've learned about boundaries, and now every limitation they impose is framed as a boundary rather than what it actually is, a wall. They've learned about their need for space, and now any request for consistency is met with accusations that you're not respecting their needs. They've learned that their attachment style makes intimacy difficult, and now they use that knowledge as a permanent excuse rather than a starting point for growth. Before their supposed healing, the avoidant would just pull away without explanation. It was hurtful, but at least it was honest in its lack of self-awareness. But now, they pull away while explaining that they're honoring their attachment needs or practicing self-regulation. They've turned their dysfunction into a wellness practice. They've rebranded their fear as self-awareness, and this rebranding is far more damaging because it's harder to argue against. When they used to just disappear, you could recognize it as poor behavior. But now, when they disappear while citing their need for autonomy to maintain secure attachment, they've made their abandonment sound like psychological sophistication. The weaponization extends to how they respond to your needs. Before healing, they might have felt some guilt about not meeting your needs. But now they've learned about codependency, and any need you express is potentially labeled as codependent. You want more consistent communication? You're being codependent. You need reassurance about the relationship? You're being codependent. You express hurt about their distance? You're being codependent. They've taken a legitimate psychological concept and turned it into a weapon that lets them avoid any responsibility for showing up in the relationship while making you feel like your needs are pathological. The healed avoidant has also learned about secure attachment and will invoke it constantly while demonstrating nothing secure. They'll talk about how secure people can be alone, conveniently ignoring that secure people can also be together without fear. They'll discuss how secure people don't need relationships to be complete, using this to justify never making anyone a priority. They'll reference how secure people have strong boundaries, using this to rationalize walls that keep everyone at a permanent distance. They've cherry-picked the aspects of secure attachment that validate their avoidance while ignoring everything about secure attachment that requires vulnerability, consistency, and emotional availability. The false confidence of intellectual understanding. The avoidant who has done surface-level healing work develops a false confidence that makes them more difficult to connect with than before. They think that because they understand their patterns intellectually, they've transcended them. They believe that awareness equals mastery. This confidence makes them less open to feedback, less willing to examine their behavior, less capable of recognizing when they're still operating from fear and defense. They've become experts on their own dysfunction without actually addressing it. And this expertise creates arrogance that shields them from genuine growth. This false confidence manifests in how they enter new relationships. The pre-healing avoidant might have had some humility about their limitations, some acknowledgement that they struggle with intimacy, but the supposedly healed avoidant presents themselves as emotionally evolved. They talk about their attachment style as if having identified it means they've overcome it. They market themselves as self-aware when they're actually just self-absorbed. They confuse their ability to narrate their patterns with actual change, and they present this confusion as enlightenment. The false confidence also makes them more judgmental of others. They've learned attachment theory, and now they're analyzing everyone else's attachment style while remaining blind to their own continued dysfunction. They'll identify anxious behaviors in their partners with clinical precision while failing to recognize how their own avoidance creates that anxiety. They'll critique others for being emotionally reactive while priding themselves on their own emotional shutdown, not recognizing that shutdown is also dysregulation, just turned inward rather than outward. They've become attachment police. Everyone else's patterns are problems, while their own patterns are just their authentic needs. The intellectual understanding also gives them a false sense of control. They think that because they can identify when they're deactivating or when intimacy is triggering them, they can manage these responses. But understanding something cognitively is completely different from being able to change it emotionally. The avoidant can say, I'm deactivating because you're getting too close, and my nervous system interprets closeness as threat, while still being completely controlled by that deactivation. The narration makes them feel in control when they're actually still prisoners of their fear, just prisoners who can describe their cell with impressive vocabulary. The new justifications for old patterns. What's particularly dangerous about the supposedly healed avoidant is that they've acquired new justifications for the same old patterns, and these justifications sound so much more legitimate than their previous ones. Before healing, when they pulled away, they might have said, I just need some space, or I'm busy with work. These excuses were transparent and easy to recognize as avoidance. But now they pull away while citing attachment theory, nervous system regulation, the importance of secure autonomy, and suddenly their avoidance sounds like psychology rather than fear. The new justifications center around self-care and healing. The avoidant has learned that healing requires alone time, so now all their withdrawal is framed as necessary healing work. They're not avoiding you. They're processing their emotions. They're not being inconsistent. They're listening to their body's need for space. They're not running from intimacy. They're engaging in self-regulation practices. Every old avoidant behavior gets a new therapeutic label, and that label makes it much harder for partners to identify what's actually happening. They also justify their patterns by claiming they're protecting their partners. They've learned that their attachment style can be difficult for others, so now they frame their distance as consideration. They're keeping you at arm's length for your own good because they don't want to hurt you with their limitations. They're being inconsistent to protect you from getting too attached to someone who might not be able to meet your needs. This framing is particularly insidious because it makes their avoidance seem altruistic rather than self-protective, like care for you rather than fear within them. The supposedly healed avoidant has also learned about differentiation and uses it as justification for never actually merging lives with anyone. They talk about maintaining separate identities, having independent interests, preserving autonomy within relationships. All of these things are healthy in moderation, but the avoidant uses them to justify never actually building anything integrated with another person. They want entirely separate lives with occasional overlap, and they've learned to call this differentiation rather than what it actually is, avoidance of genuine partnership. The selective application of growth. One of the clearest signs that the avoidant has become worse rather than better after supposed healing is how selectively they apply what they've learned. They've absorbed all the information that validates their avoidance while conveniently ignoring anything that would require them to change. They can recite chapter and verse about why they need space, but they've somehow missed all the information about how avoidants need to practice staying present when intimacy feels uncomfortable. They know everything about their triggers, but nothing about how to work through those triggers rather than just avoiding them. The selective application is particularly obvious in how they relate to their own needs versus others' needs. They've learned that their needs for space and autonomy are valid and should be honored, and they're absolutely right. Those needs are valid, but they've somehow failed to learn that other people's needs for consistency and closeness are equally valid and should also be honored. They expect their partners to accommodate their attachment style while showing no willingness to stretch beyond their comfort zone to accommodate their partner's attachment needs. The supposed healing has made them more entitled, not more empathetic. The avoidant has also selectively learned about trauma and its impact on attachment. They understand how their childhood created their avoidant patterns, and they use this understanding to excuse their current behavior. Their parents were emotionally unavailable, so now they're emotionally unavailable. And somehow, this cause and effect chain means they bear no responsibility for changing. They've learned about their wounds, but not about their accountability for healing those wounds. They want understanding for their limitations without being willing to work on expanding their capacity. What they've missed, either deliberately or unconsciously, is all the information about how secure attachment is built. They've skipped over the parts about practicing vulnerability in small doses, about staying present when you want to flee, about communicating your internal experience instead of just acting it out through withdrawal. They've ignored the guidance about how avoidants specifically need to challenge themselves to stay when everything in them wants to run. They've cherry-picked the information that lets them stay comfortable, while dismissing everything that would require genuine discomfort and growth. The illusion of progress through awareness. The supposedly healed avoidant has confused awareness with transformation in ways that make them more stuck than they were before. They can identify their patterns with impressive accuracy, and this identification creates an illusion of progress. They'll tell you, I know I'm pulling away right now, or I recognize I'm deactivating, and they expect this recognition to count as growth. But recognition without different behavior is just sophisticated stagnation. They're watching themselves repeat their patterns while narrating what they're doing, and they think the narration is the same as change. This illusion of progress is reinforced by their therapist, their reading, and their own internal narrative. They've spent time and money on healing work, so they need to believe they've made progress to justify that investment. They've learned new language and concepts, so they feel more evolved. They can have meta conversations about their attachment patterns, which creates a sense of being above those patterns rather than still trapped within them. The intellectual distance they've created from their own experience makes them feel like they've transcended their issues when they've just found a more sophisticated way to avoid dealing with them. The illusion also comes from comparing themselves to who they were before their supposed healing. They're less unconscious than they used to be, less likely to act out their patterns without any awareness. This feels like progress, and in one sense it is. Awareness is better than complete blindness. But awareness without behavioral change is such minimal progress that calling it healing is generous to the point of delusion. They've moved from unconscious avoidance to conscious avoidance, which is barely movement at all. What makes this particularly tragic is that their belief in their own healing prevents them from doing actual healing work. They think they're done, they think they've arrived, they've checked the boxes, went to therapy, read the books, learned the language. They don't realize that real healing is ongoing, that it requires continued practice and growth. That intellectual understanding is just the very beginning of a much longer journey. Their premature declaration of being healed means they stop working right when they should be beginning the actual transformation process. The impact on partners. Partners of supposedly healed avoidants face a unique and particularly painful challenge. They're dealing with someone who appears self-aware, who talks a good game about attachment and relationships, who seems like they understand their patterns and are working on them. This appearance creates hope. Maybe this avoidant is different. Maybe this one has actually done the work. Maybe this one can show up differently because they're so aware of their patterns. But that hope gets systematically destroyed as the partner realizes that the awareness is all surface, that the behavior hasn't changed at all, that in fact it's worse because now the avoidant can gaslight them using therapeutic language. The partner finds themselves in impossible positions. They express a need and get told they're being codependent. They point out hurtful behavior and get lectured about attachment styles. They ask for consistency and get accused of not respecting boundaries. Every legitimate relationship need gets pathologized or dismissed using language the avoidant learned in their supposed healing journey. The partner ends up feeling crazy, questioning their own needs, wondering if they're actually the problem. The supposedly healed avoidant is more damaging because they're more convincing in their deflection. Partners also face the challenge of not being able to argue effectively against therapeutic language. When the avoidant says, "I'm just honoring my attachment needs," how do you counter that? When they claim, "I'm practicing healthy autonomy," how do you point out that what they're actually doing is avoiding intimacy? When they insist, "I need to regulate my nervous system," how do you explain that their regulation looks like abandonment? The therapeutic framing makes it nearly impossible to address the actual behavior without sounding like you're against mental health and healing. The most painful aspect for partners is the realization that they've been sold a false bill of goods. The avoidant presented themselves as self-aware and working on their patterns. The partner entered the relationship believing that this awareness would translate into different outcomes, but the outcomes are the same as they would be with any avoidant, just dressed up in fancier language. The disappointment is profound because it's not just about the relationship failing, it's about the betrayal of discovering that the supposed healing was performance rather than transformation. The defensive superiority complex. The supposedly healed avoidant develops a defensive superiority complex that makes them insufferable and impossible to connect with deeply. They believe they're more enlightened than people who haven't done therapy or read about attachment. They look down on people who express needs directly as less evolved. They pride themselves on their emotional control while viewing emotional expression as lack of regulation. They've taken their intellectual understanding of psychology and turned it into a shield of superiority that protects them from having to actually be vulnerable or wrong about anything. This superiority complex manifests in how they respond to conflict or feedback. Instead of engaging with the content of what their partner is saying, they analyze their partner's attachment style. "You're being anxious right now" becomes a way to dismiss legitimate concerns. "That's your protest behavior" becomes a way to avoid accountability. They've turned attachment theory into a weapon that lets them pathologize their partner's responses while never examining their own. They're always the one who's regulated, boundaried, self-aware, while their partner is always the one who's dysregulated, codependent, unconscious. The superiority also comes through in how they talk about past relationships. Before healing, they might have had some confusion about why their relationships always failed, but now they've figured it out. All their exes were anxiously attached or codependent or emotionally immature. They were just trying to maintain healthy boundaries while being pursued by people who couldn't respect their needs. The supposedly healed avoidant has rewritten their entire relational history to position themselves as the enlightened victim of other people's dysfunction, never acknowledging their own role in relationship failures. This defensive superiority makes them completely closed to growth. You can't teach someone who believes they already know everything. You can't offer feedback to someone who thinks they're more evolved than you. You can't point out blind spots to someone who's convinced they've examined everything. The supposedly healed avoidant is more defended than the unconscious avoidant because they've built a fortress of intellectual superiority around their wounds, and that fortress is much harder to penetrate than simple walls of silence or distance. The permanence of pseudo-healing, what makes avoidants who become worse after supposed healing particularly concerning, is how permanent their state can become. The unconscious avoidant might eventually hit rock bottom, experience enough pain from their patterns that they become motivated to do real work. But the supposedly healed avoidant has already done what they think is the work. They've been to therapy, they've read the books, they've gained awareness. In their mind, they're done. This belief that they've already healed creates a permanent plateau where real growth becomes nearly impossible because they have no motivation to go deeper. The pseudo-healing also creates a comfortable narrative that lets them avoid the discomfort of genuine transformation. They've found a way to be avoidant while feeling good about it, to maintain their walls while calling them boundaries, to continue their patterns while believing they're being psychologically sophisticated. Discomfort is the engine of growth. Real healing requires sustained discomfort, willingness to stay in difficult feelings, commitment to changing behaviors that feel natural and self-protective. But why would they do that when they found a way to avoid all that discomfort while still feeling evolved? The supposed healing also inoculates them against future feedback or interventions. When someone points out that they're still avoidant, they can dismiss it by pointing to all the work they've done. When a partner expresses hurt about their behavior, they can explain that they're just honoring their attachment needs and the partner should educate themselves. When a therapist tries to push them toward deeper work, they can find a new therapist who will validate their current state. They've built an identity around being healed that protects them from having to actually heal. What this creates is an avoidant who is permanently stuck at surface level awareness, unable to progress to genuine transformation. They'll go through relationship after relationship, job after job, friendship after friendship, always convinced that other people are the problem, that they're doing their best, that they're as healed as they can be. They'll never hit the bottom that might motivate real change because they've built a comfortable landing spot at the level of intellectual understanding without emotional integration. And they'll cause tremendous damage along the way, particularly to partners who believed their presentation of self-awareness meant they were capable of something different. The path to actual healing. Real healing for the avoidant looks nothing like what the supposedly healed avoidant has done. Real healing requires moving beyond intellectual understanding into embodied change. It means not just identifying when you're deactivating, but actually staying present when everything in you wants to run. It means not just recognizing your need for space, but also recognizing your partner's needs and finding compromises that honor both. It means not just talking about your attachment wounds, but doing the deep, painful work of actually healing them through corrective emotional experiences. Actual healing involves humility, not superiority. It requires recognizing that awareness is just the first tiny step of a very long journey, not the destination. It demands willingness to hear feedback from partners without immediately dismissing it as their anxious attachment talking. It necessitates ongoing therapy that goes beyond insight into behavioral change, working with a therapist who will challenge rather than just validate. It involves practice, repeated practice, of new behaviors that feel uncomfortable and vulnerable, staying in relationships when you want to flee, expressing needs when you want to hide, receiving love when you want to deflect. True healing also means recognizing that attachment work is lifelong, not a project you complete. Even avoidants who do genuine transformative work will always have avoidant tendencies that need management. The difference is that truly healed avoidants take responsibility for managing those tendencies rather than expecting everyone else to accommodate them. They recognize when they're deactivating and communicate about it rather than just acting it out. They push themselves to stay present even when uncomfortable rather than always choosing comfort. They view their attachment style as something to work with, not an identity that excuses all their behavior. The avoidants who actually heal are the ones who remain humble about their progress, who understand that growth is measured in behavior change, not vocabulary acquisition, who stay open to feedback from partners and therapists, who are willing to be uncomfortable for extended periods, who don't use their awareness as a shield against accountability. These avoidants are rare because real healing is hard. Much harder than learning some terms and going to therapy for a few months. But they exist, and they're completely different from the supposedly healed avoidants who have actually become worse through their pseudo-transformation. The tragedy is that the supposedly healed avoidant will likely never read this and recognize themselves in it. They'll read it and think about all the other avoidants who give them a bad name, who aren't as self-aware as they are, who haven't done the work they've done. They'll miss that they are the supposedly healed avoidant this describes because that's what pseudo-healing does. It creates enough self-satisfaction that real self-examination becomes impossible. And so they'll continue on more defended than ever, more articulate in their avoidance, more convinced of their enlightenment, causing damage while believing they're evolved, stuck while believing they're healed, worse while believing they're better.